was a sheriff's deputy for over 30 years, and I thought I'd seen everything. But one night, around 2 a.m., my best friend called me crying from an abandoned logging road, saying he'd been attacked. I rushed to pick him up, and when I reached, My name is Daniel Mercer. I'm 71 years old now, long retired, but I spent over 3 decades carrying a badge as a sheriff's deputy in Washington County, Pennsylvania. When you work that long in a rural department, your mind becomes a catalog of human misery. I've worked the grueling night shifts, those long grinds from dusk until dawn, where your whole world is shrunk to whatever your high beams can cut through. As a deputy, you do a bit of everything, responding to midnight dispatch calls, handling routine traffic stops on pitch-black county roads, and facing the grim reality of actual crime scenes. Back then, I prided myself on being completely thick-skinned. If you let the blood or the desperation rattle you, you wouldn't last a year on the force. Over the years, I handled situations that would break a normal person. I remember responding to a call at a remote farmhouse and walking straight into a gruesome double homicide. The living room was a bloodbath, and the suspect was still inside, cornered in a pitch-black hallway, manic and clutching a large, blood-slicked hunting knife. My pulse didn't even spike. I just kept my flashlight held high and out away from my body, a standard tactical habit so he couldn't accurately strike at my center mass. Using the edge of the beam to lock onto his hands while I used a calm, steady voice to control his movements, disarmed him the second he hesitated. Then there was the time I discovered an old local farmer who had been pinned under a flipped tractor in a remote field for 3 days before anyone realized he was missing. It was deeply disturbing, sure, but to me it was just physics, a tragic accident with a clear cause and effect. Even in high-intensity standoffs, cold intellect always ruled my head. I once had to breach a barricaded trailer at 3 a.m, face to face with a man pointing a loaded Remington shotgun straight at my chest. Instead of panicking, I rapidly analyzed the scene, noticed his finger wasn't actually inside the trigger guard, used his first name to calmly de-escalate the tension, and had him cuffed in minutes. After surviving all of that, I truly believed everything in this world had a logical explanation, a clear human motive, or a paper trail. I thought my gut was bulletproof, and that nothing could ever truly rattle me. Until that night, that changed my life forever. Before I go any further, I need you to understand something. What happened to me that night was different, because it didn't just scare me. It permanently changed the way I look at people. Even now, decades later, I still catch myself staring a little too long at strangers, wondering if there's something behind their eyes that shouldn't be there. So if you're listening to this somewhere quiet right now, maybe in your room, maybe alone in your house, just understand. Once you hear this story to the end, that quiet feeling of safety you take for granted might not feel the same anymore. It happened in late October when I was 39 years old. I had just finished a brutal, exhausting 14-hour shift. It was just past 2 a.m, and the temperature had plummeted, leaving a thick, low-lying fog rolling over the gravel parking lot of the precinct. I had just clocked out, walked to my personal truck, and turned the key in the ignition. I was just sitting there in the dark, waiting for the heater to defrost the windshield so I could make the lonely drive home. My wife was up north in Erie for the week taking care of her sister, so I knew I was heading back to a completely empty, silent house. I was looking forward to nothing but a glass of water and collapsing into bed. That was when my cell phone started vibrating violently against the center console, fully expecting it to be the desk sergeant calling me back inside to fix a mistake on my incident paperwork. Instead, the glowing green screen read a name I knew better than my own, Raymond Cole. Ray was my absolute best friend, a guy I've known since we were kids, causing trouble in high school. We had a bond built on decades of trust, shared secrets, and late-night drives. Ray was the complete opposite of me, naturally funny, incredibly energetic, loud, and completely incapable of taking life too seriously. If we went into a local diner, Ray would have the entire staff laughing within 5 minutes. I remember one time my truck broke down in a torrential downpour, and Ray drove 2 hours out of his way just to bring me a cheap plastic umbrella and crack terrible jokes to make me feel better. He was my anchor to a normal, happy world outside of the grim realities of my job. I knew the exact cadence of his voice, his laugh, his hand gestures, everything. But when I pressed that phone to my ear, the voice that came through didn't sound like the Ray I knew. The pitch was his, the words were his, but the energy was entirely gone, replaced by a raw, breathless terror that made my stomach instantly drop. He was hyperventilating, sobbing so violently that he could barely choke out the words. He told me he'd been mugged. He said he was driving home along a desolate, abandoned stretch of an old logging road near the county line, a place completely surrounded by thick woods and empty, dark fields, when someone forced his car off the road. He said they took his wallet, his house keys, his car, everything, and left him stranded in the pitch black. Because there was no such thing as dashboard GPS screens or smartphone maps back then, he had to guide me purely by memory, frantically telling me he was about a mile past the old Miller's Creek Bridge, right where the paved road turns into loose gravel across from the abandoned, overgrown lumber yard. He begged me to come get him, his voice trembling so hard it sounded like it physically hurt to speak. Under normal circumstances, standard police protocol dictated that I call this into dispatch immediately, but in that moment, my cop brain completely shut off. This wasn't an official case or a standard police matter. It was deeply personal. My best friend was in raw, unfiltered distress, and all I could think about was getting to him as fast as possible. I didn't say a word to anyone at the precinct. I just threw my truck into reverse and tore out of the parking lot. The drive out to that isolated logging road felt like a descent into an entirely different world. The deeper I drove into the rural outskirts, the more the environment seemed to warp into something completely suffocating and hostile. The thick, ancient pine trees closed in on both sides of the narrow road, their heavy branches hanging low over the asphalt, like skeletal hands reaching out through the blinding fog. The truck radio cut out completely, dissolving into a harsh, rhythmic static that seemed to sync up with the heavy thrum of my tires against the crumbling asphalt. As the silence of the woods pressed against the truck windows, a strange, uneasy thought started creeping into my mind. What the hell was Ray even doing out here at 2 a.m? This abandoned logging route didn't lead to his house, his office, or any place he ever frequented. It was a completely dead stretch of land, surrounded by nothing but miles of pitch-black timber. I tried to push the suspicion aside, telling myself there had to be a rational explanation, but my cop instincts were starting to flare up in a way I couldn't ignore. Finally, I slowed the truck to a crawl as I reached the exact area he described, right across from the collapsed rotting structures of the old lumber yard. I rolled the truck forward, the gravel crunching loudly beneath my tires, until my high beams sliced through the mist and swept across a single, stationary silhouette sitting perfectly still on the edge of the dark road, waiting for me. I killed the high beams on my old '92 Ford F-150, leaving just the dim running lights on as I threw the truck into park so I wouldn't blind him. The fog was so thick it felt like a living thing, heavy, suffocating, and pressing up against the windshield, actively trying to swallow the hood of my truck. Pushing the door open, I stepped out into the biting October air, and the absolute weight of the environment hit me like a physical blow. The woods out there didn't just feel dark, they felt completely dead. There was no rustling of leaves, no nighttime insects, no wind, just a flat, unnatural silence that made the loud crunch of my boots on the loose gravel sound dangerously exposed. Out of the safety of the truck's steel frame, a sudden, heavy wave of isolation settled over me. The damp chill seeped straight through my uniform, and my breath plumed into thick white clouds that immediately dissolved into the mist. Out of pure, ingrained cop muscle memory, my hand automatically reached down to my belt, gripping the cold aluminum casing of my heavy tactical flashlight. My thumb instinctively found the rubber pressure switch on the tail cap, and I clicked it on. The sharp, powerful beam sliced a clean tunnel through the swirling fog, illuminating millions of floating water droplets. I swept the light forward, and the beam landed on a slouched silhouette sitting on the rusted guardrail. The figure was completely curled inward, head buried deep between its hands, body shaking violently, but with the dense fog distorting the light and his face entirely hidden, I couldn't say for certain it was Ray. In my line of work, you never just assume, even when you're expecting someone. It was just a nameless, broken shape in the dark. I cautiously closed the distance, the gravel shifting loudly beneath my boots, my pulse starting to thrum in my ears. "Ray," I called out, my voice sounding strangely thin and swallowed by the empty woods. "Ray, is that you?" The figure didn't look up. Normally, the loud rumble of my truck approaching, the heavy clatter of it parking, the bright flashlight beam, or a human voice would make anyone immediately snap their head around. In a silence that absolute, the sound of my engine had been completely amplified, tearing through the quiet, yet this person stayed absolutely rigid, squeezed tight into a ball. He seemed completely paralyzed, hiding within himself. I stepped closer, the beam tracing the torn fabric at his shoulder and the heavy mud caked down the side of his jeans. The clothing looked familiar, matching what Ray usually wore to work, but the total lack of reaction made my gut twist. I closed the final remaining feet, lowered my flashlight slightly so it wasn't blinding him, and reached out to firmly grab his arm. The moment my hand touched his sleeve, he violently flinched away, curling his body even tighter inward and squeezing himself desperately back against the rusted iron rail. "Please don't kill me," he whimpered, his voice escalating into a frantic, breathless chant that made my skin crawl. "Please don't kill me. Just take whatever you want. Please don't kill me." He was trembling so hard his teeth were audibly chattering, completely trapped in a state of raw, blind terror. I immediately dropped my flashlight to the gravel, ignoring all tactical protocol, and slammed both of my hands firmly onto his shoulders to ground him. Ray, look at me, buddy. Relax. It's just me. It's Daniel. You're safe, man. It's me. It took a few agonizing seconds, but my voice seemed to pierce through the panic. His chanting abruptly cut off. He slowly, hesitantly snapped his head up, his eyes wide, bloodshot, and frantic as they finally focused on my face through the mist. Now, under the ambient glow of the flashlight resting on the ground, I could finally see him clearly. "Daniel," he choked out, his chest heaving as he grabbed onto my jacket sleeves, looking around wildly into the pitch-black timber behind me. "Daniel, is that really you? Please tell me it's you." "Yeah, Ray, it's me. I've got you," I reassured him, keeping my voice as steady and calming as humanly possible, though my own chest was tightening with a sickening dread. Now that his face was finally uncovered, the physical reality of what happened hit me. A dark, nasty bruise was already swelling his left eye shut, and raw, jagged scratches were split wide across his cheek. When he gripped my arms, I saw the skin on his knuckles was split and bloody, looking like he desperately tried to fight back before being overwhelmed. Seeing my best friend, the guy who was always the loudest, happiest person in any room, completely shattered like this, entirely erased my analytical mind. I didn't care about looking for tire tracks, footmarks, or suspect descriptions. I just picked up my light, hooked my arm under his, and guided his shaking frame toward the passenger side of the truck. The moment we stepped inside the truck and slammed the heavy door shut, the contrast was immediate and jarring. The suffocating, hostile silence of the dead woods was instantly locked outside, replaced by the humming warmth of the cabin and the steady blast of the dashboard heater. It felt like crossing a threshold back into reality, a sudden cocoon of safety. As I shifted into drive, I looked over at him, the green dashboard lights catching the raw cuts on his face. "Man, what were you doing out here?" I asked. Now, for a bit of context, Ray worked in commercial real estate. He was a guy who was always chasing the next big listing, completely obsessed with his job and always willing to go the extra mile to lock down a client. But even knowing that, finding him out here at 2 a.m. made absolutely no sense. The question broke whatever dam was holding him back, and the quiet inside the truck was instantly replaced by a torrent of manic, hyperactive energy as he started venting at 1,000,000 miles an hour. I thought to myself that this was just typical Ray, talking and talking and talking, using a relentless wall of words to process his own panic. So I just sat back and listened to what he was trying to tell me. "Daniel, man, thank God. I thought I was gonna freeze out here," he stammered, his hands shaking so violently he could barely clasp them together over the heater vent. I had this commercial real estate client, this guy from out of town, who insisted on looking at the old lumber yard plot tonight because his flight leaves tomorrow. I knew it was off route. I knew it was sketchy, but I needed the listing, Daniel. I was just waiting in my car and was about to head home when this dark sedan pulls up out of nowhere. 2, maybe 3 guys got out. They didn't even say anything, man. They just dragged me out, started hitting me, kicking me. They took my wallet, my house keys, all my belongings, even my cell phone, and just took off in my car. I didn't know what else to do. I just started walking and calling you. I listened intently, my eyes darting between the dark gravel road ahead and the severe swelling around his left eye. As a deputy, My immediate cop instincts were shouting at me that he needed a proper medical evaluation. His head had taken a severe beating. He could have a concussion, and those raw facial lacerations needed to be cleaned properly. "Ray, listen to me," I interrupted gently, keeping my tone measured. "You don't look good at all, man. I need to take you to the hospital right now. Let the doctors check your head out, and we can get a report filed." Ray immediately shook his head, his hands flying up in a desperate, pleading gesture. "No, Daniel, please. No hospitals," he choked out, his voice cracking with a fresh wave of panic. "No doctors, no police stations tonight. I can't handle it. Let's just go to your place. I just need to rest right now. I don't need to go anywhere else. I can't be alone tonight, Daniel. Please, just take me to your house." A heavy internal conflict ran through my mind. Part of me knew the responsible, logical thing was to insist on the ER. But looking at the sheer fragility in his posture, my instincts as a friend completely overrode my training. I wanted his comfort first. He was deeply traumatized, entirely vulnerable, and he was begging for a safe spot, not a sterile hospital room surrounded by flashing lights and paperwork. I cared about his emotional survival more than protocol in that moment. "All right," I said softly, reaching over to place a reassuring hand on his shaking shoulder. "We're going to my place. You're staying with me tonight." I navigated the truck back onto the main road, heading toward home. Because my emotions were running so high, focused entirely on keeping him calm and processing the shock of seeing him like this, my brain completely glossed over the finer details of his explanation. I didn't analyze the story. I just wanted to protect him. Since my wife was up in Erie and our guest room was available, it made sense to just get him a safe place to crash. For the first 5 minutes of the drive, the sheer noise of his adrenaline dump felt completely normal. Ray kept talking, obsessing over the details of the mugging, cursing the guys who did it, his voice filled with that familiar, high-strung cadence I had known since high school. I kept my eyes locked on the dark, winding road, nodding along and constantly reassuring him that the worst was over. But then, as we hit the long, straight stretch of Route 19, the conversation just stopped. It wasn't a natural lull in the talk, either. Ray stopped mid-sentence, right after saying, "They just came out of nowhere," and a heavy, suffocating silence dropped over the inside of the truck like a lead weight. The sudden quiet was jarring, an absolute contrast to the manic terror he had been projecting just a second ago. I glanced over at the passenger seat, expecting to see him tearing up or collapsing into quiet tears. Instead, Ray had stopped shaking entirely. He was sitting perfectly rigid, his back pressed completely flat against the seat, staring straight out the windshield into the swirling fog. The silence stretched on for a couple of miles, becoming incredibly uncomfortable, almost toxic. The intense trauma he had just been displaying seemed to have entirely processed through him and vanished, replaced by a bizarre, unreadable stillness. Trying to break the thick tension, I cleared my throat and said, "Hey, when we get to the house, I've got some ice packs and some old sweatpants you can borrow. You want me to call the precinct and have a deputy swing by tonight, or do you want to wait until morning?" Ray didn't turn his head. He didn't even blink. He just sat there for a few agonizing seconds before giving a bare minimum, hollow response. "Morning," he said. My grip tightened on the steering wheel. His voice didn't have the shaky, traumatized edge it had 5 minutes ago. It didn't sound like a man in shock. It sounded flat, completely empty. I frowned, keeping my eyes on the road, a small knot of unease forming in my gut. "All right, we'll get you cleaned up first. You feeling dizzy at all? They hit you pretty hard in the face." Again, there was a long, unnatural delay, as if the person next to me had to calculate how to respond. "Fine," he murmured. I kept watching him out of the corner of my eye as the dashboard lights cast a faint, sickly green glow over his profile. The scratches and bruises were definitely real, but his expression had completely transformed. The panic, the tears, the chattering teeth, all gone. He just stared blankly ahead, his jaw completely relaxed, almost slack. And then, as we turned down my suburban street and the shadow of the overhanging trees swept across the cab, I saw it. It was subtle, so quiet I tried to convince myself the dashboard shadows were playing tricks on my exhausted mind, but a faint, slow smirk began to spread across his face. It wasn't a smile of relief or comfort or safety. It was an empty, mechanical upturn of the lips that didn't reach his eyes at all, like something mimicking the shape of a human smile without understanding the emotion behind it. A cold prickle of sweat broke out along the back of my neck. My cop instincts, the deeply buried ones that told me when a routine day was about to turn deadly, were suddenly screaming at me that something inside the cab of my truck was deeply, fundamentally wrong. But I looked at his torn clothes, the blood on his skin, the familiar shape of my best friend, and I forced the terror down. I told myself it was just severe psychological shock. People react to trauma in weird ways, right? I pulled the truck into my driveway, hit the garage door opener, and rolled inside. I killed the engine, and the dashboard lights died, leaving the two of us sitting in the pitch black of my sealed garage. I hit the wall switch, and the heavy garage door rattled shut behind us, sealing out the damp night air and plunging the space into absolute darkness before the dim overhead bulb flickered to life. The transition from the hostile, foggy woods to the familiar confines of my home should have brought a wave of relief. But as I guided Ray through the mudroom and into the kitchen, the atmosphere inside my own house felt entirely wrong. It felt heavy, restrictive, as if the walls themselves were rejecting the presence of the person walking next to me. That same heavy, unreadable stillness that had taken over him on the highway only deepened now. He stood perfectly still in the center of the room, his arms hanging limp at his sides, his face completely pale and blank under the warm yellow kitchen lights. He didn't look around, he didn't comment on the safety of the house, and he didn't ask about my wife, Sarah. He just stared at the blank wall, his movements entirely unnatural and completely drained of human emotion. "Ray, sit down at the counter, buddy," I said, my voice sounding hollow in the quiet house. I walked over to the freezer, pulling out a bag of frozen peas to act as a makeshift ice pack. "You've got a nasty concussion coming on. Let me put some ice on that eye." He didn't look at the ice pack. He didn't even turn his head. "No," he said. The word was flat, clipped, completely stripped of any human cadence. "I just want to relax." I insisted. "Ray, your face is split open. You're covered in mud." But he cut me off, his voice maintaining that exact same emotionless pitch, like a person forcing out words in a foreign language they were trying to mimic without understanding the actual feeling behind them. "I just want to relax. I'm hungry. Can we have something to eat?" I frowned, a growing knot of unease tightening in my stomach. "Well, Sarah is up north in Erie for the week, and she does most of the cooking, so we really don't have anything to eat here," I told him. Let's just order something from outside." While I was saying that, I stepped back and opened the refrigerator, confirming it was practically bare minimum inside. The only real substance on the shelves were those 2 heavy cardboard crates of raw farm eggs I'd bought from a local supplier down the road. I kept that entirely to myself and didn't say a single word about the eggs to Ray. I'll tell you in a bit why I didn't tell Ray about those eggs. Personally, I wasn't worried about the food. Because of my hours as a deputy, I mostly ate out while on duty anyway, and I had already eaten a heavy, solid meal right before Ray's distress call, so I was only planning to order for him. Turning back to him, I continued, "Let me call the 24-hour Cloverleaf Diner over on Black Road. I can order us a double cheese pizza or something. I know that's your favorite." Ray's eyes didn't track me. He just stared blankly ahead. "No, I want a classic triple-decker club, the one packed with extra eggs." I walked over to the wall-mounted corded kitchen phone and picked up the receiver. But just as I was about to dial the number, a sudden realization hit me like a physical jolt, and I stopped completely mid-action. I lowered my hand from the keypad, turning around to look at him. "Hey, wait, what did you say? Eggs? Are you all right? You're allergic to eggs. They make you incredibly sick." Ray had a pretty nasty allergy to them since we were kids. If he even had a single bite, his stomach would twist into agonizing knots, and he'd spend the next 12 hours violently throwing up. I still vividly recalled an incident back in high school when he mistakenly ate a scoop of potato salad loaded with egg mayonnaise at a football tailgate party. He ended up severely dehydrated and completely miserable for days. Ray instantly cut my train of thought off, his wide, bloodshot eyes staring straight into my soul. "No, don't worry about it," he said, his voice completely flat and hollow. "I read in a health magazine that your body chemistry completely changes every 7 years. I tried some last month and nothing happened. The allergy is gone." It was a flimsy, stupid explanation that made absolutely no sense, but at that point, I decided to just play along. Still, I was totally unsure about the order. I turned back to the wall and dialed the diner's number, placing it in a hesitant, incredibly unsure tone. While I was giving the order to the overnight line cook, the anxiety got the better of me. I held the phone up, pausing mid-sentence, and asked Ray one more time. "Hey dude, are you sure about this? You want the eggs?" Ray didn't even blink. "Yeah, just do it." I finished the call with a knot twisting in my gut, entirely bewildered by how casually he dismissed something that always made him violently ill. I told myself desperately that he was just in severe psychological shock and that trauma makes people act entirely out of character. He was just crashing from the adrenaline. When the delivery guy's headlights finally swept through the driveway 15 to 20 minutes later, I rushed to the front door, paid the teenager, and brought the brown paper bag into the kitchen. I set it on the counter, expecting Ray to sit down at the table like a normal human being. Instead, he grabbed the bag before I could even open it. He didn't use a plate, he didn't use a napkin, and he didn't offer me a single bite. He tore the sandwich out of the paper packaging and began to eat it like a ravenous animal. It was deeply disturbing to watch. He was shoving massive pieces of the sandwich into his mouth, barely chewing before swallowing, his jaw working with a strange, violent speed. Thick yellow egg yolk and mayonnaise smeared across his cheeks and dripped down his chin, staining his torn shirt, but he didn't seem to notice or care. There was no pausing for breath, no conversation, and absolutely no manners. Looking at him in that light, a chilling thought hit me. I couldn't even recognize the person sitting in front of me. The real Ray was always the life of the party. He was happy, jolly, and relentlessly talkative, a guy who filled every room with infectious energy. But this person was entirely different. This was just a physical shell, a creature brainlessly consuming food with a terrifying, hollow vacuum where his personality used to be. While he was standing there devouring the food like an animal, I couldn't bear to watch it anymore. I quietly slipped away down the single-level hallway into the guest room, turned down the blankets, and laid out some old sweatpants and a clean shirt for him before walking back to the kitchen. I stood by the kitchen sink, watching him finish the last bite, wipe his bloody, yolk-stained hand across his jeans, and stare flatly at the floor. "All right, buddy," I said, my voice shaking slightly. "Let's get you into bed." I guided him down the dimly lit hallway on our main floor toward the guest room, trying to handle everything as comfortably and normally as possible. But the moment we reached the open doorway, Ray stopped rigidly in his tracks, blocking the entrance. He turned his blank, bloodshot gaze to me and insisted he could take it from there. I hesitated for a split second, looking at his stiff posture, but I didn't want to push him or make things more awkward. I just nodded, left him standing at the threshold, and walked back down the hall to my own room. I threw my heavy uniform onto the armchair and collapsed into bed. I was already physically exhausted from the grueling 14-hour shift, but the harrowing ordeal with Ray and everything else that had transpired completely doubled my exhaustion. My mind and body just gave out, and I fell asleep instantly. I woke up around 4:30 a.m., I guess, a stubborn habit of mine to use the attached master bathroom and grab a glass of water. I stepped straight into my attached bathroom, took care of my business, and then quietly walked out of my bedroom and padded down the hall to the kitchen to fetch a glass of water. After finishing the drink, I walked back into my bedroom, but just as I was about to sit back down on the mattress to fall asleep, the absolute silence of the house was shattered by a dull, indistinct thud coming from down the hall. It was faint, but enough to freeze me in place. My first thought flashed instantly to the diner food. I figured the eggs had finally caught up with his stomach, and he was violently ill. I immediately got up to check on him, stepping cautiously out into the dark corridor. There was enough pale moonlight filtering through the windows for me to easily walk in the dark toward his room without needing to turn on any lights. The hardwood floorboards felt like blocks of ice against my bare skin. The guest room was a bit far from my bedroom, down at the other end of the same single-floor layout, but as I slowly crept down the hallway, the shadows elongating under the moon, a new sound began to filter through the quiet. It was only when I drew close to the guest room door that the sound became clear. It was a whispering, but it wasn't a normal human conversation. It was Ray's voice, speaking in a very low, rhythmic murmur, chanting incomprehensible words that I couldn't understand. It sounded like a bizarre, ancient foreign language, the kind of unsettling Latin or Hebrew chanting you hear in old horror movies, a low-frequency hiss that vibrated right through the drywall. My heart was thudding so violently against my ribs, I was certain he could hear it. My hands broke out in a cold sweat as I reached out, my trembling fingers wrapping around the cold brass doorknob. I took a deep breath, trying to summon my deputy authority, and knocked firmly on the wood. Thud, thud. Instantly, the chanting cut off. The silence that followed was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. A few agonizing seconds ticked by. Then, the lock clicked, and the door swung open just ajar. The door was open only slightly, leaving a narrow gap where I couldn't see anything past him into the darkness of the room. Ray just stood there rigidly, his frame completely blocking the narrow space. "Are you all right?" I asked, my voice tight. "I hope the eggs didn't make you feel sick." Ray's voice replied flatly, completely stripped of any human inflection. "No, I'm good. What happened?" "No, I heard something," I said, a cold sweat breaking out on the back of my neck. "I heard a sound. Were you talking to someone?" "No, I was sleeping," he said. As he spoke, he shifted his position slightly. The pale moonlight streaming from the guest room window cut right behind him, framing his body in a sharp, stark silhouette against the darkness of the hallway. Through that narrow gap, the backlighting revealed everything at once. It illuminated the guest bed behind him, perfect, pristine, and completely untouched, the blankets pulled entirely taut, and in that sharp silver glow, the intense rim lighting caught the unmistakable, blocky outlines of dried mud caked onto his shoulders and the stiff, warped shape of his collar. He was still in the exact same clothes from the woods. I stood there, staring at his backlit profile for a long, heavy moment in total silence. A weird, deeply uncomfortable tension hanging in the air between us. "All right, fine," I whispered, trying to hide the trembling in my voice. "Go back to sleep." But before I could step away, the certain wrongness of it forced one last question out of my mouth. "Oh, wait. You haven't even changed yet?" Ray's silhouette didn't move an inch against the pale light. "Yeah, I was too tired, so I just crashed." Hearing that flat lie while staring into the blank darkness of his face, where the moonlight caught only the wet, glassy glint of his unblinking eyes, sent a freezing dread straight to my core. My cop instincts flared violently, screaming at me to push the door open, to demand answers, and find out what that chanting really was. But looking at that lifeless, reflective glint in the shadows, a deep, irrational fear paralyzed me. I was terrified of what the answer might be if I pushed him. I forcefully shut my instincts down, desperately convincing myself that he was just too traumatized to rest properly. "Nothing," I whispered, stepping back into the shadows. "I just thought I heard something. Go back to sleep." Ray just kept staring, and then slowly, silently pulled the door shut. When dawn finally broke, casting a dull, gray light through the kitchen windows, I woke up with a pounding headache. The moment I opened my bedroom door and stepped into the hallway, I was hit by a physical wall of odor. It was a sickening, rancid, overpowering smell of sulfur and decayed, rotten eggs. The stench was so thick it coated the back of my throat. I instantly gagged, slamming my hand over my mouth to keep from throwing up right there on the floorboards. Tearing up from the smell, I hurried down the hall and burst into the kitchen. I stopped dead in my tracks, my jaw dropping in absolute horror. The kitchen was a scene of chaotic, primitive devastation. The entire room was covered in a sticky, yellow film. Dozens of raw eggshells were completely crushed and scattered across the linoleum floor, ground into the grout, and smeared across the countertops. Inside the sink, raw yellow yolks were pooled in plates, half-eaten and left to rot in the morning heat, dripping down the edges of the wooden cabinets. It looked like a frenzied, Animalistic feeding had taken place in the dead of night. Trembling, I stepped over the sticky mess and approached the refrigerator. I pulled the heavy door open. The 2 large cardboard crates of raw farm eggs, 24 eggs in total, were completely empty, the cardboard torn to shreds. I scanned the rest of the shelves. The milk, the leftover ham, the bread, nothing else had been touched. Everything else was pristine. Only the raw eggs were gone. It defied all human logic. It made absolutely no sense. Panicking, I ran down the hall and threw open the guest room door. "Ray," I shouted. The room was completely empty. The clean clothes I had left out for him were still sitting on the chair, untouched. The bed, too, was completely untouched and intact. The sheets were still perfectly smooth. Ray was entirely gone. I searched the bathroom, the living room, and ran out to the garage. My truck was there, but there was no sign of him anywhere on my property. My breath coming in short, ragged gasps, I ran back into the foul-smelling kitchen. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely manage to unlock my cell phone. I dialed Ray's cell number, praying to God that he would pick up and tell me this was all some sick, convoluted nightmare. It rang once, twice, 3 times. A click. "Hello?" a voice answered. But it wasn't the flat, completely emotionless voice from the truck or the guest room. It was warm, energetic, slightly groggy from sleep, but completely normal. It was the exact, unmistakable cadence of the real Raymond Cole. "Ray," I stammered, tears of raw panic starting to sting my eyes. "Ray, where the hell are you? Why did you leave my house? What happened in my kitchen?" There was a long pause on the line, followed by a light, confused chuckle. "Daniel, what the hell are you talking about, buddy? Leave your house. I'm in Pittsburgh." My entire world tilted on its axis. The air left my lungs. "What?" I choked out. "I'm at the Hilton in Pittsburgh," Ray said, his voice entirely clear now. "The annual Pennsylvania Association of Realtors convention. My firm sent me out here 2 days ago. I'm looking out my hotel window at the city right now. I don't get back until tomorrow night. Is everything okay over there? You sound hysterical." The realization hit me like a physical blow to the chest, an icy wave of absolute horror that shattered my mind. If Ray was in Pittsburgh, if he had been there since the past 2 days, who was inside my truck? Who did I firmly hold by the shoulders? Who slept down the hall from me? What did I bring into my home? "Daniel, Daniel, talk to me. You're scaring me." Ray's voice crackled through the receiver. I couldn't breathe. The psychological terror was so overwhelming that my hand acted on pure survival instinct. I violently tapped the screen to end the call, dropping the cell phone onto the counter and severing the connection mid-sentence. I collapsed backward onto the kitchen chair, my knees completely giving out. I buried my face in my hands, my mind fracturing as I stared at the crushed eggshells and raw yellow slime coating my floor. The sheer weight of the unexplainable reality broke something inside me. Suddenly, the cell phone rang loudly from where it sat on the counter, the shrill electronic chirp shattering the silence of the room. I flinched, staring at the screen in absolute terror, my heart hammering against my ribs. It rang 3, 4, 5 times. Finally, knowing my duty, I forced myself to reach out and pick it up with a trembling hand, pressing the talk button. Mercer, I choked out. "Deputy Mercer?" Thank God. The sharp voice of Miller, the morning desk sergeant, came through the line. Shift transition ended 15 minutes ago, and the watch commander is pacing the floor. Your unit hasn't checked in for the morning briefing. Where the hell are you? Staring at the horrific mess on my kitchen counter, I squeezed my eyes shut, a lone tear cutting through the cold sweat on my face. I couldn't go in. I couldn't look at a badge, or a suspect, or a crime scene ever again without seeing those wide, blank eyes. "Miller," I whispered, my voice cracking completely. "I can't make it in today. I'm violently sick. Call the watch commander for me. Tell him I'm taking a personal day." Before Miller could question me, I hung up the call, walked into the living room, and crashed onto the couch, holding my head in the dark as the smell of the kitchen began to seep into the rest of the house. It's been 32 years since that night. 32 long years, and I can honestly say I have never been the same person since. I did resume office after 2 or 3 days. I had to. It was my duty, the uniform demanded it, and I couldn't just walk away from my responsibilities. But the man who went back to the department wasn't the fearless cop who had walked out. Before that night, I used to handle the worst of it without blinking. The brutal homicides, the grisly crime scenes, the tangible human threats you could actually track, outsmart, and fight. But this situation was entirely different. It was a cold, unexplainable vacuum that completely shattered my understanding of reality, exposing a deep vulnerability in me that I never knew existed. To this day, I still cannot get that night out of my thoughts. The loop just plays endlessly in my head, over and over again. Who was that thing? Why did it look exactly like Ray? The mere thought of it scares me to death, the chilling, sickening realization that I willingly picked it up from the pitch-dark woods, brought it straight into my home, and let it stay the night down the hall from me while I lay in bed completely unprotected. There is another deeply unsettling detail that I think about constantly now, something you guys in the audience might not have fully parsed. Think about how its behavior transformed. When it first called me on the phone, and even when I pulled it into the passenger seat from the dark, muddy edge of the woods, and it sat there, explaining the attack, it actually sounded normal. It was energetic, frantic, and typically sounded exactly like the Ray I had known for years. But right after it finished recounting the whole incident, it was like a switch flipped. All that human energy instantly vanished. For the rest of the drive, it became entirely quiet, flat, and emotionless. The warmth just completely drained out of its voice, leaving a dead, empty mask. It makes my skin crawl to realize it now. Whatever was mimicking my best friend could only sustain the illusion of his personality just long enough to deliver its cover story before the facade totally fell apart. And then, the smaller questions just rot in my brain. What was the deal with the eggs? Why was it so utterly obsessed with them? Why did it ignore the few other items in that nearly empty fridge, like the bread and milk, just to brainlessly gorge itself on raw farm eggs in the dead of night, grinding the crushed shells into my linoleum floor? But the final, most terrifying riddle is something I only connected much later. It's a detail that maybe you guys completely missed too. Think back to the explanation it babbled to me in the cab of the truck, explaining how it ended up in those woods. It looked straight ahead and said, "They just dragged me out, started hitting me, kicking me. They took my wallet, my house keys, all my belongings, even my cell phone, and just took off in my car. I didn't know what else to do. I just started walking and calling you." In all my panic as a best friend, my brain completely blew past the contradiction. I didn't question it in that moment. But think about the completely glitched logic of that sentence. If they took his cell phone, how the hell did he call me? And it was Ray's exact mobile number that showed up on my screen. Whatever was sitting in my passenger seat didn't just steal my best friend's face, it tripped over its own script, delivering a blatant, impossible lie that my panicked mind was too blind to see. For over 3 decades, I never told a single soul about what happened in that house, not even my wife, Sarah. When the real Ray returned from Pittsburgh, he asked me many times about that frantic, hysterical phone call. Completely confused by my reaction, I just brushed it off and lied to him. I told him I wasn't in the right frame of mind, that I was severely sleep-deprived from my grueling shifts, and that I had just woken up from an incredibly vivid, horrific, bad dream. I was too terrified to tell the truth. I knew if I told anyone what I actually experienced, people would think I was completely crazy or losing my mind. But finally, after all these years of carrying the weight of it alone, I decided it was time to break the silence and tell you guys about this. Because the older I get, the more the finality of that night haunts me. They say seeing is believing, but I never saw it leave my house. Is it still out there? Maybe it never left my house in the first place. To this very day, I still look around these empty walls and wonder. Whenever my wife is at the stove cooking and the distinct smell of eggs begins to waft through the kitchen, my chest tightens and my throat goes completely dry. My eyes automatically begin to wander here and there, scanning the dark corners of the hallway, checking the heavy shadows under the guest room door, wondering if that thing is still inside, perfectly quiet, just waiting to munch on them again.